Well, congratulations to the two panelists, because the audience has come back. Well done. I think you've done very well in that you've retained them on a Saturday night. That's very good. Okay, we're going to go straight to the questions. There are about 6 or 7 questions here that I'm not going to address, only because they are actually written up in a shorter, more succinct version in some of these other questions. And if you don't think that your question has been answered, we will have an opportunity to ask you, okay? So pick the ones that have written it out in a much sharper way. This is from Mr. Kumar, S. Kumar, and it is directly for Mr. Shah, Dr. Shah. It says, you say caste is a foreign product, but the manuscript was written in the 4th century AD. And I assume that the reference is to some scripture. I mean, the Vedanta, the Ved was written,
I think the question
we don't know
means
when,
the Manusmriti.
but it means the manuscript, maybe? Yes. So I think they're referring to that. So that is to Dr. Shah, and I'd like you to address that directly, please, Dr. Shah.
Yeah, it's more of a comment than a question, but I can see that there's a kind of implied question there, right?
Yeah.
Because, of course, many of the pro-legislation lobby, including Satpalji and his collaborators, claim that Manusmriti is a kind of if you like, an instruction to Indian society at large to discriminate en masse, basically, right? It provides a sanction for discrimination. I think I said enough in what I was saying earlier that Indian society is actually not structured in that way, as far as we know, right? You can only read Manusmriti as a mass sanction or sanction for mass discrimination if you already accept the Protestant account of Indian culture and society, and specifically Indian religion, right? So whoever, and there are many even so-called intellectuals like Arundhati Roy and Kancha Elia, there are many intellectuals in India who argue in that way that Manusmriti basically is a sanction for mass discrimination, which is of course immoral according to them. It's no such thing. None of these writers seriously considers the position of Manusmriti in the Indian traditions, right? Was it a piece of legislation? If so, who legislated it? Was it a private tract which was written by some Pandit or the other, right? What was its actual function in Indian society? Was it a set of instructions, or was it simply a set of, let's say, heuristics, right? According to which somebody should go about solving disputes, right? Because many people look at it as a legal text.
So what are the answers to
this?
So the answer is that this is being selective of just one script out of all the scriptures?
No, it's simply giving a particular view without having any background theory to back up that view.
Okay.
Right? So the background theory is there, but it's implicit.
The other question we have is, if this legislation refers to as an aspect of race, how does this affect the future, for example, in the census data? And this question is from Harish Thakkar, and it's an open question to both. Maybe you'd like to answer this, Mr. Muman. If in the legislation caste is understood as an aspect of race, as it is in the current legislation, caste is an aspect of race, what effect does this have in future, for example, on the census? What categories will we be asked to put our names against, I suppose, is the assumption.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. There has been a misunderstanding in what the campaigners are calling out for. This is to do with the census enumeration, and as campaigners, we have never demanded that the law should have caste enumeration. So as far as campaigners are concerned, we are not demanding it, we are not asking for it. We don't believe that anyone applying for a job should first have to disclose their caste. We have made that point to the government, and government have taken note of that.
So if I do not declare my caste, and I wish to suggest that somebody is discriminating against me on caste basis, how do I make my appeal if there is no explicit category or explanation of my caste and the other person's caste? So how can we have legislation that doesn't ask for that enumeration isn't it inevitable that it will be part of the
the law will kick in if somebody has suffered harassment of some form at a place of work, and that whoever is the victim will have to justify that they have been victim of caste discrimination, which will then be subject to the due process of law.
Under the race category.
As an aspect of race, that's where it stands.
So it will be racial discrimination.
Well, it would be an aspect of racial discrimination if it's not the same as racial discrimination. And that's where the subtle differences between caste discrimination and racial discrimination. Otherwise, caste would be categorized as a race. That is why the lawyers have been very careful in phrasing this legislation that caste is an aspect of racial discrimination.
I am not a lawyer.
It is not
Mr.
racial
Muman,
discrimination.
Mr. Muman, I'm not a lawyer and I do not go to court. However, I'm quite an advocate for the English legal system and legislation. I am really, really disturbed by what you've just suggested, that we are going to, it will kick in only at the accusation of caste discrimination, and therefore it is subject to interpretation as to whether it's race or caste, and I'm confused by that. But we're going to leave it at that, because I'm going to ask...
Anuja, you must allow me a comeback.
Okay, here. If you must.
I must. I said the whole thing is subject to due process of law. Whoever feels victimized on whatever grounds will have to put up their case, and the judge will have to make a decision in terms of whether the argument is upheld or not.
Right. So, for example, scenario, I feel discriminated against by my employer, who is a man, okay? And because he's an Englishman, I cannot suggest that he's discriminating on my caste grounds. However, if he's an Indian or a Sikh man who has a particular jati, I can now suggest that it is caste discrimination. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it has to be proved in a court of law.
I understand it has to be proved in a court of law, but even before I take my court case to the lawyer, they are going to ask under which circumstances I'm suggesting it's caste. Can I do caste discrimination against a white man, is what I want to know.
That would be racial discrimination.
Or a black man.
That would be a racial discrimination.
So colour comes into this, and then, so you have to be an Indian for me to suggest that you're discriminating against my caste. Is that right? I'm just trying to understand my position.
Yes, I would say so.
So I can only bring caste discrimination against another Indian.
Not an Indian.
It is a phenotype, and it is an inherited position. Yeah. Is that right?
You see,
this is going to tie into another question we're going to call on later. But okay, thank you, Mr. Muman. I'm going to ask Dr. Shah to answer this now.
I want to answer the question in a slightly unexpected way, which is the link between caste and race. So, of course, Satpalji is distorting the issue because, you see, when you look at Kailash, you see different faces of Kailash, right? So, all of those faces, if you see, I can see Kailash, you're just seeing one or two faces at one time. But that's Kailash, isn't it? So, in the same way, those are, when you say, I see an aspect of Kailash, you are seeing a face of that. So, when somebody says caste discrimination, what it says is that it's a face of racial discrimination. In other words, it's tantamount to racial discrimination. Right? It's not different from racial discrimination. It is tantamount to racial discrimination. Now, where does this idea of racial discrimination actually come in, or caste as race? If you go back to the censuses that the British anthropologist administrators were doing in the British censuses in India, you see the leading British anthropologists advocating that, or surmising that there are basically two races in India. One is a black one and one is a white one. Right? That was his hypothesis. And how does he back up his hypothesis? Or how do all the people who supported this kind of framework of studying Indian society, the only thing they could go back on is the presence of an Aryan invasion sometime in the past. Right? So it's the Aryan invasion which comes in. Yeah, there's a group of people, the Aryans, who come into India, subordinate the existing race, right? So the black race is the subordinated one, the white one is the invading one. Now the Europeans actually they said, well, actually introduced a kind of religion which maybe had some kind of suggestion of the true revelation. But the Christians so all I'm saying is that it's so easily, you see, you have to understand this framework in order to understand how it is that a European legislature like the British Parliament can so easily assume that caste is an aspect of race. It's in their history, it's not in our history. Right? The Aryan invasion theory was not constructed by us, it was constructed by the Orientalists.
Okay, so the census data is based on a particular phenotype. You understand that, which is a racial type.
No, I don't think phenotype helps you to understand it.
No,
it's
it doesn't. It's not the black and white issue then.
It is a black and white issue, but it's more than just phenotype.
Right, now it is more than anything.
Can I raise another point?
Yes.
You asked me a question, can I bring a case of caste discrimination against a white man? But let me ask you another question to do with this. Can a white man bring a case of racial discrimination against a white man?
There have been such cases.
Now, the subtlety of that case will have to be established by the judge.
It's got nothing to do with subtlety.
But there's nothing to stop you from bringing a case.
Satpalji, it's got nothing to do with subtlety. The English courts have already accepted that an English person in Scotland who feels discriminated against can sue. And he can sue on the basis of national origins, but national origins also happen to be an aspect of race.
So this is what we're saying. You see, in the census data, and I've done analysis of census data over time, in the 50s and 60s, we had only one category, South Asian, okay, for the subcontinent. People of that area were all South Asian. In 1961, 62, 63, we started having an influx of Asians coming in from East Africa. 1981 census data has a category, South Asian and East African Asian. So East African Asians became a category. Today, in 2001 census, we have your country of origin, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or India, related to a national sort of position. So the question that's being asked very correctly by Mr. Tucker is, if we bring in caste now, there is going to have to be a change in census. And therefore, how are we going to manage this? And is there any real ramifications that we should be concerned about?
For the British census, can I agree with Satpalji for a change here?
Please.
He's absolutely right to suggest that all the reports that have been written so far, nobody countenances the inclusion in the British census of a question on caste. But I think you also had a very good point in the sense that as soon as I start to contemplate litigation, caste issue comes to the surface. So willy-nilly, any employer who has a diverse workforce will want to know about the caste of his employees. So indirectly, you are opening the door to that anyway. Whether it's in the national census is a different question, but all workplaces are also required to keep records of their workforces, right? That's an obligation already, particularly in the public sector. That's an obligation under the law, under the Equality Act. And that could easily be extended to the caste
the census data
as well. Yeah.
And the census is not a fixed, natural categorization. It has changed over time. And I'm going to leave that at that moment because we really can't resolve that here, but it's something to think about. Okay, this question is a very interesting one. I'm going to leave that to the end. It says, this litigation, this legislation, is it going to divide the ethnic minorities of Britain into further categories and create what we already see amongst Muslim and the Shia and the Sunni? This is a question for both of you, I think, because there is no name. I think it's from Jyoti.
Perhaps the question can be asked more specifically, what do we see between the Shia and the Sunni that we're going to see?
Well, it's a division of the groups. They've referred to ethnic minorities, but really the suggestion is this going to create divisions amongst the diaspora, the Indian diaspora generally?
It's not a very well put question, if I may say so.
I'm afraid not, but that's exactly what the question is.
Let me deal,
further divisions,
if I may. You see, the law is there to protect victim of caste discrimination. And So, and what this means, the law establishes a certain set of values, certain set of norms, and it's a human rights element that we are talking about here, spreading dignity and self-respect. And if a particular community is discriminating against another community, and the law has taken account of that, what the law will do, it will cause the person to think twice before they cause that kind of discrimination. It doesn't divide the community, it just makes the community think twice that they ought not to discriminate against another person.
Not really.
So you think this legislation...
So what it universalizes its principle of equality. And it makes the person think twice before they discriminate. So it will have an action of harmonization rather than divisions.
So you think this legislation will harmonize rather than divide?
Satpalji, you really have to get onto a higher level of discussion here, because nice sounding sweet words like human rights and harmony and so on doesn't really help to see what the implications of this legislation will be. You haven't managed to answer any of my suggestions about the distortive effects of the importation of the idea of caste into English law. It distorts the social structures that exist within Indian culture and society, right? Now, if a law is premised on a distortion, it will create victims. It doesn't help victims, it creates victims. Right, and you haven't been able to answer that. How are you going to?
Let me respond to you.
Could you hold on a minute, please?
Let me concretize my question. You see, because DJ Nihal was suggesting that Navratri events are potentially unlawful. What do you think about that?
This was a particular question, by the way.
If I have a pandit officiating at the ceremony of my daughter's wedding, right? And is that a potentially discriminatory act? All these kinds of questions, it's actually a Pandora's box of new questions, which are not answered by the kind of sweet words that you utter. And none of your collaborators have actually anticipated the real effects of the legislation. They simply promise and say, oh, it's going to be a nice, sweet world afterwards, where everybody just lives in harmony. The law teaches nice lessons. We can anticipate our behavior according to a law. I'm sorry, the law is already distorting our experience. So how can we anticipate the behavior of such a law? Right? How can we, make our behavior accord with the distortive effects of the law? We can't. It's impossible. So the onus is on you to justify that. Please do so.
The onus is not on me to justify anything.
No, because you are actually... Come on,
Satpal. No, Mr. Muman, actually, as instigators, and your organization, and I'm not referring to you personally, are the instigators for the inclusion of caste into this legislation.
The instigator...
And therefore, you are accountable for your actions, according to what Dr. Shah has said. If we are going to see those divisive and very conflictual situations being created where they do not actually exist at the moment, then we are opening up, as Dr. Shah has suggested, a Pandora's box.
With due respect,
is that right?
As I indicated earlier in my address, the law applies to 3 areas. It applies to provision of goods and services, employment, and education. Nobody is talking about monitoring Navratri. It doesn't apply to arrange marriages. And so I can't personally cannot comprehend how it would extend to Navratri celebrations.
Satpalji, that shows that the kind of law you're advocating, you're not even aware of the kind of structure within that law, the law within which that sits, right? The caste law, it sits within an act of parliament which says if you let out premises on a discriminatory basis, it's unlawful. Right? So a Navratri event will prima facie be unlawful if I'm saying only members of my own Jati organization can have at least first access to tickets. If there are spare tickets, Satpal ji can have them, Anuja ji can have them, anybody else can have them, right? But first are my people. Right? That is a discriminatory act under the law. And what's being
the discriminatory element of the Navratri situation is if there is a Navratri celebration,
let me round off my point.
If a person A is being prevented to participate in the Navratri celebration, then there could be a case.
Thank you.
And
right, so you
explained.
thank you very much.
Yes, if you're prevented from it.
So it's not just goods and services, it's not just employment, it's a whole series of other activities of social life, associational life, which will be impacted. Now, you mentioned the Shia-Sunni issue. If you look at the legislation closely, it provides exemptions for discrimination on religious sect as well. So we don't expect all Muslims to live happily together and so on, particularly if they are divided along Shia-Sunni lines. A few months ago, a BBC reporter asked me, she said, there's been an issue about Shias being refused funeral services by Sunni organizations or mosques. I said, well, that's perfectly lawful because the Equality Act already contains exceptions for such kinds of, let's say, discriminations. They're not unlawful discriminations, basically.
Well, let me ask you, do you want to stop people from participating in your Navratri celebrations?
No.
Yes,
now,
yes, why not?
Hang on, we're getting away from the question.
You don't have a right to a Navratri
Excuse me, we
celebration.
only have 2 minutes left. The understanding and the answer to the question is that the legislation is comprehensive because it sits under the Racial Equality Act, okay? And under the category of race discrimination. It is not a separate category. It has no provision for protection on social events or other events. So it is not just about the 3 categories that Mr. Muman has suggested. Okay, now that is the answer to that question. The third question and the last question we wanted to talk about was, where is the legislation at the moment? What do you think should go forward? Or where can we go? Can we still oppose this, or is this going to be taken forward? I'm going to let Dr. Shah first explain to us where we are in the process.
As I started off in my talk, we are actually on the cusp of the legislation potentially being brought in, or the implementing legislation being brought in, because there is an obligation on the minister to do so. Now, at the moment, you can see the ministers fudging it, right? Because they don't want it. This Tory government is against the legislation, as far as I can tell, right? But because they've been put in this very silly position, I would say, it's not even weird, it's silly, right? By the Labour and the Liberal parties, or certainly large sections of those parties, that's what the situation is currently, right? Not only that, without waiting for an actual implementation of this law, the courts have gone ahead in this Turkey and Chandok case to declare that the Equality Act already covers caste discrimination. So we are in double trouble. Not only do you have the potential of the legislation being brought into force, which it hasn't, you already have case law which endorses claims of caste discrimination. Because judges have already said you can do it on grounds that it is discrimination on the basis of descent, which is already included in the idea of race, right? So the judges have really stretched the Equality Act and snuck in caste discrimination, right? And with the complicity of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, with the complicity of lawyers groups, and it's a kind of disgusting situation as far as I can see, right? We were not even allowed to intercede as expert witnesses in the Turkey case, right? Which established this, right? Which shows you how the law constantly is creating barriers for our community, because we can't even have our voice heard, right? In this allegedly due process of law that other people have so much faith in. Yeah, what kind of faith can you have in this legal system?
Mr. Muman, do you have a response? Where is the legislation, and where would you like to see it go?
Well, we want the law to be implemented and outlaw caste-based discrimination.
Are you content with it as an aspect of race, considering all the issues that we've discussed today? And are you happy that it could possibly go into the census data categories, etc., etc.?
There is a discussion taking place, and so there will be a further consultation with the stakeholders. And so I would reserve the judgment until the outcome of that consultation. So I'm not going to prejudge that. I want to take this Navratri issue a little bit further, if I may.
No, I'm sorry, we have no time, because we are going to have another kind of little moment to discuss things. I just want to summarize where we're at, and then because this can go on, however, I think the audience has become quite aware of where we are today. We are at the point of implementation of caste legislation where a caste discrimination accusation can be placed against me, and the judge will then allow the evidence to be brought forward, and it will be judged according to the race category. Basically, that's what it means, isn't it? I think that's what I'm understanding. At the moment, under the race category, any form of race discrimination in any environment and in any context is illegal. And therefore, as Mr. Muman has suggested, 3 categories in which the caste discrimination will apply is not true, is not valid. It will apply in all aspects of social and public life. Yeah? No, if I was to make a comment on Twitter tomorrow, incitement to caste hatred, yes, under the Racial Equalities Act, I can be taken to court for that. All right? I can be taken to court under the legislation as it stands today if I was to put up a derogatory comment about caste under this new legislation.
Cyber would go under the Racial and Religious Hatred Act.
That's right. It would go into the Racial Hatred Act. However, it would be initiated by an accusation of caste discrimination. All right? And that is what Mr. Muman and his team are trying to protect victims from. The victims and I asked several times for cases. I wanted real evidence. There are 31 substantive evidence cases that have been brought up about caste discrimination, and we should be very aware that 27 of them, I understand, are actually related to the Sikh community and not the Hindu community. And that should be clearly understood as well. So if Mr. Muman has anything else to add to that evidence base, yeah, and not just the anecdotal evidence that has been brought forward, he will have now an opportunity to speak about that. And Mr. Shah, who has suggested that this legislation shouldn't even be brought forward and should not be implemented, because he has reservations about how it will be implemented within the courts in Britain, has to bring up a case to suggest, apart from prejudice, apart from the idea that judges have already prejudged based on some sort of Protestant ethic or Protestant interpretation, is almost equivalent to saying that they're all imperialists. I don't buy into that, I'm afraid. So I think he's got a case to make as well still. All right? So from both sides, that is the summary of where we're at. I think and this is what I understand, and because we're running out of time, we're going to give 5 minutes to each panelist to speak. And I'm going to allow Mr. Muman the first opportunity, and then Dr. Shah will have the last word on it. Mr. Muman? 5 minutes, and please stick to time.
I don't think I will take the 5 minutes. You see, on the point of evidence, I'm not here to present any evidence. I am here to argue the case for victims, and it's not necessary for me to present what that victim's case is. The government has established that there is a case to be answered, and so they have legislated. All we are asking as campaigners that victims deserve to be protected, and so therefore we believe that the law has a normative effect, that it will think or cause the perpetrators to think twice before they discriminate against anyone on the basis of caste, and that should establish the societal norms of dignity and self-respect that every person deserves. And caste discrimination or discrimination of any form is a human rights violation. And what our campaign is doing is to raising the profile of human rights to ensure that all people who inhabit this earth are treated with dignity and self-respect, and that if their dignity and their self-respect is violated, that they have a recourse to the legal due process of the place where they live. So that is the only point that I want to make and summarize. And you are either a lover of human rights or you are against human rights. And human rights are universal principles. They don't stop and start with a particular race or a particular caste. These are universal principles, and there is a challenge across the world where people are fighting to establish their human dignity, to establish their human rights, and this campaign has to be understood in that context. So thank you.
Dr. Shah, I'm going to let you last word.
Thanks a lot. Sajid,
So, if Prakash Ji has asked for me to actually allow his co-director of the Dharmic Ideas and Policy Foundation, Dr. Gautam Sen, who's the ex-lecturer at London School of Economics, to come and do the 5-minute concluding remarks. So if I could invite Dr. Sen to come in and just conclude in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good evening. I know you're all eager to go home now, so I will really stick to 5 minutes. Just a few factual issues, and I will then also make my sentiments clear. In 2008, August, the Hindu Forum, Swaminarayan, and myself attended a meeting with the CLG Ministry in London to discuss this caste issue. And my two colleagues were very upset with the ministry that such a legislation was proposed. And after a lot of ranting and raving, the senior civil servant smiled at me and asked and said, there is no evidence of caste discrimination that we could find, and the legislation will not take place. So I went away happy until 2010, and this, of course, happened. One pertinent point that I want to make, which Prakash has already anticipated, is that aside from the rights and wrongs of the case being made and argued against, if I'm an employer or a doctor or organizing Navratri, in order not just to protect myself, but ensure that I'm fair, I really want to know your caste. How the hell am I going to avoid inadvertently causing offense? Somebody comes in, and I think this is a very dark Tamil Brahmin who's higher caste than me, and I don't like him for some reason. He may turn out to be a Dalit. And he'll say, oh, well, you have discriminated because you didn't let me in. So I want to know, so I will have to keep records for my own protection and also to ensure fairness. If I'm an employer, I've got to make sure that my promotion is done according to some criteria of fairness, and I will have to think about caste very carefully. Otherwise, it would be unfair. So it may not be in the national census, but I will have to have my private census. And then I could get into even more trouble if I say to you, I'm not going to employ you if you don't tell me your caste, because I'm scared. So that will result in me being taken to court in the first instance. This is a very deadly, divisive outcome. Where there was no caste, my son will come back and say to me, 5 years old, Mummy, that boy called me a bloody Patel in the playground. And I happen to be a Shah, so I think I'm a higher caste, right? I think so. Shah is higher than Patel. Even I don't know it. Now, this can run and run and run, and the community will end up very divided with lots of problems which Prakash has more than enumerated well. As it happens, I'm not a believer. I'm actually a bit like a Jain or a Buddhist. I don't believe in a creator. I'm culturally Hindu. I did not know until last year what my caste was. I discovered purely by chance when Suchitra Sen died, and I noticed she had a suffix to her name. And I asked my cousin, why does she have the suffix? Because they were actually friends of ours. She said, that indicates she's a Brahmin. And then she said to me, don't you know your suffix is Sharma, which is a Brahmin? I said, I didn't know this all these years. So where it did not exist, you will definitely lower your caste, and I don't know if that makes for consciousness. My own feeling is the legislation will probably pass 70-30, but it's not over yet. We are contesting it. I'm, of course, in favor of everybody being treated badly, not well. Everybody being treated badly, because I'm a misanthrope. Not treated unequally. Bear in mind, something else will happen, and the proverbial shit will hit the fan when that happens. Muslims and Christians are allowed to sue Hindus on the basis of their antecedent caste. So when you have Muslims taking Hindus in England to court, there will be demonstrations outside the British High Commission in Delhi. I can promise you that. Indo-British relations, and I hope there's somebody here going to report to the Home Office, is going to hit a low. And that will be their just desserts for doing what the evangelists want. This legislation has got nothing to do with you and me. It is entirely to do with it going to the EU next. I hear in the United States, Australia, Canada, and the UN to harass the Indian government at every venue so that you allow Muslims and Christians the same rights as Hindus for caste quotas. That is the biggest stop to conversion. It is all about conversion. Will it succeed? I don't know. But this is a diabolical ploy, and bear in mind the church pushed for a very long time until Adolf Hitler came and finished their problem in Europe. You will either have to kill most of the Brahmins or convert them, and then the church will be happy. It is not going to happen so easily. Thank you.
I think Dr. Sen has just introduced the next debate for Vichaar Manthan. And we will take it up, I'm sure, if time allows and the venue. But all that's left for me is to thank both the panelists, and I'd like you to applaud them both for their very courteous presentations. And of course, a very, very heartfelt thank you to the audience who've sat through this very politely, very respectfully, and listened to all the arguments so carefully. And thank you very much. And good night.
Thanks to the chair as well. Very